Good evening, everyone. I'm John Abbott, President and CEO of WGBH, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this notable evening with the courageous and legendary Daniel Ellsberg, in partnership with our friends and colleagues at the University of Massachusetts. Tonight's conversation couldn't be more timely. Our past informs our present, and we're reminded that the power and courage of one person's actions fighting for the truth and the greater good can change the course of history forever. And we're very honored to be host to this evening. Among the special guests with us, I'd like to acknowledge a few dear friends, our former Congressman Michael Capuano and his wife Barbara, who are here with us. And I think Bob Feldman, who's the chair of the board of New England Public Media, was going to be here. He may be still in traffic, but Bob will be with us. He's chair of the board of New England Public Media, and WGBH struck a partnership with UMass that has been the result of our looking at our missions and recognizing and building around our shared commitment to deepening democracy through quality journalism, which makes tonight's event so fitting. Earlier this year, we did come together with UMass and imagined something more vivid and vigorous for Western Massachusetts and supported New England Public Media, NEPM, the robust new Western Massachusetts media organization formed by joining our television affiliate, WGBY, with New England Public Radio. At a time when many news organizations are struggling and trusted journalism is so critically important, we're very proud to be adding new resources that will allow NEPM to broaden and deepen its coverage. Along with our newsrooms in Boston and on Cape Cod, public media is now connecting the Commonwealth through powerful local reporting that ensures access to the voices and stories that matter across our state. Through that partnership, it has been my pleasure as well to get to know Chancellor Kumble Subbaswamy, who will be introducing our speakers this evening. But I do want to note another WGBH partner on the stage tonight, and that's Charlie Sennott, who will receive a fuller introduction, but whose GroundTruth project and important reporting is housed right here at WGBH. Chancellor Swamy, as he's known, has brought a great energy to the Amherst campus since he arrived in 2012. His vision for excellence, his commitment to educating the next generation has led to the highest achieving student body in the history of the campus. The UMass mission of public service and their strategic goals of supporting student success in an environment of inclusion align strongly with our own public media mission. And we look forward to continuing our work together and our continuing impact working in support of the Chancellor's vision for UMass in supporting his leadership for our flagship public research university, of which we're so proud. Please join me in welcoming Chancellor Kumble Subbaswamy.
Thank you, John, for that very kind introduction, and to WGBH for partnering with us on this event. What a great way indeed to honor our new media venture, New England Public Media, through this event. We look forward to a long and fruitful collaboration indeed. Welcome, everyone. I'd really like to extend a special welcome to UMass trustees Charlie Wu, Steve Tolman, along with our former UMass trustee Jennifer Braceras. I don't know if they're already here or stuck in traffic. Many of our guests may be still in traffic. We also welcome Bob Mahoney and Mary Glospan of the UMass Amherst Foundation Board. Thank you all for joining us for what really promises to be a remarkable evening. When Daniel Ellsberg released the Pentagon Papers to the media in 1971, as a personal note, I want you to know that I came to this country in 1971. And so my idea of the American democracy is really rooted in what happened in 1971, and a lot of things happened in 1971. Most important of it, perhaps, for reasons of history, is the release of the Pentagon Papers. He exposed the US government's deceitful role in the Vietnam War. For his actions, he was prosecuted under the Espionage Act, with his dramatic courtroom trial ending in a mistrial. Over the past 50 years, Daniel Ellsberg has continued his work as an anti-war crusader, a defender of freedom of the press and patriotic whistleblowers, and a powerful voice against nuclear weapons. Throughout his life, his commitment to protecting the sanctity of the truth has always outweighed his personal well-being. Consider that while we are here this evening with Mr. Ellsberg celebrating his work, what if his prosecution had not ended in a mistrial? When Daniel Ellsberg released the Pentagon Papers in 1971, he knew a lifetime in jail was a very real possibility. Yet he chose the truth. It was a tremendous act of courage and conviction. Given the university's fundamental mission as a stronghold for freedom of expression and our long-standing commitment to social justice and accessibility, we are honored to receive his papers. As guardians of this exceptional collection, we are committed to making the work of Daniel Ellsberg's life broadly accessible, ensuring it remains in the public sphere, informing our discourse for years to come. And without the generous gift from an anonymous donor that supported the acquisition, this wouldn't have been possible. Tonight is the first step in honoring our commitment, and the timing could not be more germane, for I think we can all agree the work of Daniel Ellsberg remains profoundly, even unnervingly, relevant today. We are also honored to welcome Dr. Ellsberg's wife, Patricia Marks Ellsberg, who is a committed social activist for a long time in her own right. In 1952, after graduating from Harvard summa cum laude in economics, Daniel Ellsberg studied at Cambridge University before spending 3 years in the Marines. He then joined the RAND Corporation as a strategic analyst and consultant to the Defense Department and the White House. In 1961, he drafted the operational plans for general nuclear war and was part of a group reporting to the National Security Council during the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1962, he earned a PhD from Harvard. His dissertation research became known as the Ellsberg paradox and is widely considered a landmark in decision theory and behavioral economics. After serving in the Defense Department and later in the U.S. Embassy in Saigon with the State Department, he returned to the RAND Corporation in 1967 and worked on Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara's top-secret study of the Vietnam conflict, which became known as the Pentagon Papers. Shocked by what he saw as the inconsistencies between what the public was being told about the war and what he knew to be the reality on the ground, he secretly shared the 7,000-page study with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and later, in 1971, leaked it to the New York Times, the Washington Post, and 17 other newspapers. His trial for violating the Espionage Act, which could have resulted in 115 years in prison, ended with the dismissal of all charges due to government misconduct, including illegal wiretapping and burglary. Those same government burglars would later be implicated in the Watergate break-in, which would ultimately bring down Richard Nixon's presidency. The author of 3 books, Daniel Ellsberg, is a senior fellow of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation. He is a recipient of the Swedish Right Livelihood Award and received the 2018 Olof Palme Prize for his profound humanism and exceptional moral courage. At the age of 88, he remains a committed public intellectual and an energetic anti-war and anti-nuclear weapons activist. It is also my great pleasure this evening to introduce Charles Sennott, founder, chief executive officer, and editor of the GroundTruth Project, an organization supporting a new generation of journalists committed to restoring trust in journalism. An award-winning correspondent, best-selling author, and editor with 30 years' experience in international, national, and local journalism. He has reported on the front lines of wars and insurgencies in at least 20 countries, including the post-9/11 conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq and the 2011 Arab Spring. He also reported for the New York Daily News and the Boston Globe, where he became bureau chief for the Middle East and Europe, and a leader for their international coverage from 1997 to 2005. He has served as a correspondent for PBS Frontline and the PBS NewsHour, and contributed news analysis to the BBC, CNN, NPR, MSNBC, and others. He also co-founded Global Post, an acclaimed international news website. Charlie Sennott holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, a graduate degree from Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism, and was a Nieman Fellow at Harvard University. Please join me in welcoming Daniel Ellsberg and Charlie Sennott to the stage.
Thank you. Very accurate. Thank you.
Thank you, Chancellor. Thank you. Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? This is really an extraordinary night for all of the reasons that were stated in the introduction. But just on a personal note, this is truly an honor to be with you here, Dan, and also just to say these are the two great institutions in my life, WGBH and UMass Amherst. I'm a graduate of UMass Amherst, as Chancellor Subaswamy said, and so is my son. My oldest son just graduated. We're big fans of UMass Amherst. And I want to say thank you so much, Chancellor Subaswamy, for your leadership there. It's extraordinary. And thank you for acquiring this archive. It's really, it's an historic archive, and it's such an exciting font of research over the next years to see where you take it. And I want to say thanks, John Abbott, thanks so much for hosting us here tonight and for your kind words. Thanks. It was really an honor for us to call WGBH home, so thank you. I wanted to introduce the night by saying a program note, which is that Mr. Ellsberg's voice is a little bit hoarse, and we're gonna take that into consideration tonight. And really, I'll do my best to speak up, and I know you'll do your best to speak softly. And so we're going to be riding the microphones as we do this. And I want to really plunge into our discussion with our guest of honor tonight, Daniel Ellsberg. I think, you know, Daniel Ellsberg needs really no introduction. His courage and his conscience are part of our living history in our country. He is a legend. He's what I would call a great American hero. He's the father of American whistleblowing, and his revelation of the Pentagon Papers in 1971 changed the course of the war in Vietnam and paved a path which would lead to the impeachment proceedings of President Nixon and eventually the resignation of President Nixon. And you can't help but pick up the New York Times today and think about how incredibly relevant Mr. Ellsberg's story is and how incredibly powerful his story can inform the moment we live in right now. I'm thinking about a new whistleblower that we're yet to meet, but we're hearing a lot from, who has really been at the core opening up the situation with the Ukraine and the Trump administration. And I'm sure many of you had a chance to read about the testimony yesterday, which is being described as pivotal and really a game changer in this impeachment proceeding. So we are on the cusp of history with a man who can enlighten us on how to read this moment. Incredibly vivid details came out of yesterday's testimony. How many of you are aware of it and have been following it and have read it? Okay, great. So we have an informed audience. But the diplomat, William Taylor, what he said in providing a very vivid account of the quid pro quo is, I think, a critical issue to frame tonight's discussion. I want to say that when we think about how things were set in motion by a whistleblower, we really have a chance tonight to talk about what does it mean to be a whistleblower and about the patriotism involved in that and the courage involved in that, particularly for someone like Dan, who understood he was facing a life in prison for the truths that he would tell. I think there are so many topics to cover tonight. I'm eager to get to your questions. So I'm going to go through three very broad framings, if I could. And they're really directly going to adhere to the archive. Robert Cox, who is the head of the archive and the collections at the Du Bois Library at UMass Amherst, gave me a chance to really go through what the archive holds and think about how we might structure the conversation based on the archive. And three very broad themes. One are the notes that Dan has taken through history, where you have left these very personal notes of how you've thought about things and transformations in your life and changes in your thinking. I can't wait to see in those notes just how much Patricia informed some of your conscience and challenged you. And I saw it a glimpse of that in the documentary, and I've so admired your life together and the way your thought. I want to get into that. The second one is the legal files. This is the real, the sort of the nexus of what this archive holds, which is the legal files of the Pentagon Papers, the release, the publishing of the Pentagon Papers, but also your own trial and where that ended up. And the third one, which is to me the most exciting, is really the work you've done on campaigning against the insanity of the nuclear program in the United States of America over the last 70 years. I have spent the last week reading this book, Doomsday Machine. It was published 2 years ago. I had no idea, and I don't think I'm alone in being aware that I was not clear about how much work you had done in the last 40 years in the nuclear freeze program, and also just speaking out about the insanity of the nuclear program. There is breaking news in this book about the program and about the documents you've released all these years later. So I want to just use those three broad categories as a framing for the conversation and just dive in, Dan. And I wanted to start on a very personal note of your archive holds your thinking at an incredible moment. Can you take us back to that time in 1971 when you make a very moral decision that you're going to release these papers, that you've worked hard on being on a team that was the architecture of the war, and you realized just how misleading it was, how deceitful it was. Can you take us to that time? What led you to have the moral conviction and the courage to come forward as a whistleblower?
I have to mention a couple things. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'll try to speak very softly to keep my voice throughout this, and if you can't hear me, wave your arms or something, please. I'll try to do a little better.
Okay.
First of all, my concern was not to correct a record, a historical record. There was no urgency about that to a degree that would have put me in prison, that I would have been willing to go to prison for life just to correct the record a few years, maybe 20 years or 30 years before it came out in the Freedom of Information Act by itself. I'd become aware just that month from my friend Morton Halpern, who was still working for Henry Kissinger in the White House, that what had happened over the previous 23 years of the Pentagon Papers, from 45 to 68, which is when the study ended, was going on. It was going to continue. The war was not in process of ending. It was not going to end. It was going to get larger. And so my concern above all was to try to shorten that war, to end the war. And in the end, I thought, having tried several other things, that it was worth trying to educate people as to how we had gotten here and the pattern that was being fulfilled once again. There were earlier things that occurred to me, really, such as getting Democrats to take, above all, to share the responsibility for getting out, or even to take the main responsibility, having gotten us in, largely. And I tried to, I even drafted statements that high-level Democrats, like Averell Harriman or Ted Kennedy, or Cy Vance, might have made, to say, in effect, just briefly, don't make the mistakes we made, get us out. And we will we'll be by you, if you do that. In other words, make it possible for a president not to bear full responsibility for ending a war which no president had been or ever was willing to bear by himself. He preferred to keep a stalemate, an escalating stalemate going, to kill and have Americans killed, rather than be the man in office when we lost a war in Vietnam. So I thought only if the Democrats share that responsibility might you get. They weren't willing to do that. In effect, they said, let it become Nixon's war, then we'll get into it. My thought was, once it's Nixon's war in the fall of '69, he won't get out. And that proved to be the case, pretty much. Now, that would not have, surely sharing that, and really I would have been an insignificant member of that company, would not have given me any risk. And really could have been more effective, I thought, than what was done, but they simply weren't willing to do that. And ultimately, I had the feeling that, I came to a point that Chelsea Manning and Ed Snowden, I noticed, came to express 30 years later in almost the same words that came to me. This information should be out. No one else is going to do it, so I'll do it. That last bit, I think, the first parts of that, the people who knew there was information that had been withheld from the country that was supporting continuing a war, was shared by thousands of people, thousands within, who had the same pretty much access that I did. They just didn't come to that point of, I'll be the one to put it out. They let somebody else do it. So, in fact, when I gave the information to Fulbright and later to Senator Mathias, their attitude came first, Ed McGovern. The reaction in every case was, I'll put it out. We'll have hearings, I'll give the information, and in every case they decided, let him do it. Rather than take the brunt of being a person who, in the case of McGovern, running for president, being charged with having taken lightly the secrecy process. And Fulbright was afraid that the Pentagon would use that as an excuse to shift foreign military aid to armed services rather than foreign affairs. So rather than have that happen, let Ellsberg do it, in effect. And so that was a key thing. Meanwhile, I had the example of other people who were acting like Chelsea Manning or Ed Snowden in the sense of doing what they could to help end the war, even if it seemed insignificant and even if it exposed them to great cost. I don't know if Randy Keeler is here today. Is he by any chance? I hope to see him in Amherst. But he was a draft resistor that I heard at Haverford, Pennsylvania in August of 1969, who surprised me by saying that he was on his way to prison for refusing to cooperate with the draft. Obviously, he didn't expect to end the war by sending in his draft card, or other people sat on tracks of troop trains or sat in doorways. They really didn't. But they went to prison for years to make the strongest statement they could. Well, I felt, all right, if they can do it, they're doing the right thing for them. And the right thing for me is to do what I can. I have in my safe 7,000 pages of documents of broken treaties, falsehoods, stupid judgments that definitely deserved concealment, if possible, right. If people wanted to stay in office. And I had the documents. So I decided I would put them out. If it was the kind of risk that I'd been around many people who had risked their lives in Vietnam. I was walked in combat using my former Marine training, though I was now a civilian. And I saw courage all the time. People risking their legs, their lives, when they believed in the cause, as I had. And it seemed a very reasonable thing to do, to risk your freedom once you realized that that was the right thing to do.
What I want to do is just take a moment to stop and thank you for doing that. I think we need to remember that what motivated you, if I heard you correctly, what motivated you was saving lives. This was a chance to save lives. But what inspired you was those who had given service, even if that service was to resist the war and to resist the draft, or if that was to resist in any way that you felt you could. And I think you were inspired by that, but I think you also inspired a movement to resist the war. And your words, your courage became part of the fuel to resist that war.
Well, no, it would be more, if I may, more accurate to say that movement had inspired me.
Okay.
Without that movement, I don't think it would have come into my mind what can I do to help end the war now that I'm ready to go to prison?
Right.
The thought would not have occurred to me without Randy Keeler and Bob Eaton and David Harris and others
Right.
having gone to prison. Made it seem like, of course, that was the right thing for them to do.
Yeah.
And so I joined a movement, is what I did.
Okay.
And really, one other aspect is, I'm often described as, I think the Chancellor mentioned, as having done something that shortened a war. What my wife and I did would have had no effect without many other people later taking actions that were out of the ordinary, they weren't expected to take. It really would have had no effect. I'll mention things like John Dean, under the gun to be sure, but taking on the president and telling the truth about the crimes he had done for the president, against me largely, the White House stuff, the White House horrors.
This was the actually going after your own personal files with your
Right, in the White House, yeah.
Yeah, kind of.
The files that you're getting now, they went into my doctor's office to blackmail me into silence about what I was doing. Even after Dean's testimony, which, remember, had no documents. He had this extraordinary memory. He spoke for hours, days even, from his memory, and was pretty accurate, not entirely. And yet, if it had been his word against the president, nothing would have come of it.
Right.
It was Alex Butterfield, one of the handful of people who knew of the White House taping,
Right.
who broke his promise to keep that silent.
Right.
Only a handful, and revealed the taping. Without that, Nixon would have stayed in office.
Right.
And the war would have gone on. And by the way, what I had learned from Mort Halpern was, this war will not end while Richard Nixon is in office. The notion that he was going to end it with honor, and he really did intend to do that, was not going to be achieved. Honor to him meant keeping Tew in office.
Right.
As long as he was, and he expected to do it till 1977, early. And it was had every prospect of doing that. It wasn't going to end. The North Vietnamese were not going to accept that.
Right.
So the war was going to get longer. So without, as I say, Butterfield, Nixon would have stayed in office. The war would have continued. Without the Supreme Court deciding that the tapes must be turned over, including Nixon appointees on the Supreme Court. Without Elliot Richardson of Harvard, who had made a promise. I'm smiling here because I remember that he had Archibald Cox, a special prosecutor, as his law professor at Harvard. And somebody said that his refusal to fire Cox at the demand of Nixon proved that Charles River water was thicker than blood or something.
We know that. We call it dirty water here.
And then Elliot Richardson, and then Ruckelshaus refusing.
Right.
Again, the Saturday Night Massacre.
Right.
Without all of those things, and I could name a dozen others, nothing would have happened. So Patricia and I look back on it, we were links in a chain of actions, each one of which was necessary.
Right.
Without that one, there's millions of people who marched against the war and who contributed to this context. But there were dozens to hundreds of people who each took an action that was necessary, without which it wouldn't have happened. It's funny here, but I'm looking at Tom Oliphant of the Boston Globe, and it just occurs to me he's one more link in this, because he had, we can get back to it, but had he not written a particular story, I would not have made the copies, or Patricia would not have made the copies that made it possible for that story to keep going.
Right.
It so happens. Literally, without that story, Tom
Oliphant of the Boston Globe is here, formerly of the Boston Globe. As is my former colleague, Ben Bradley Jr., and I think it is no small link in that chain of actions to say that newspapers had great courage. New York Times, Washington Post, Boston Globe, our beloved Tom Winship, making these historic and courageous decisions to publish. It makes me think as a journalist how much I long for the days when journalism was stronger and when it had more resonance and it had more resources. And I think part of the crisis we're in right now.
It's happening this week, because despite a supposed process for a whistleblower inside the whistleblower to get information without prosecution, without threat, to Congress, definitely. A process that didn't exist in my day, the Whistleblower Protection Act and
Right.
for intelligence agencies. He or she,
Right.
I hope it's a she, because
That'd be
everybody's
good.
assuming it's a he, and I'd like it to turn out to be a she, may well.
And just to set context, we're talking about the whistleblower who has now come
On
forward,
the
who set in
Ukraine,
motion
on
the
the- on the-
Ukraine
yeah,
issues
right.
that have led to the impeachment
Okay,
proceedings.
very few people have noted the following thing. This process does exist now, didn't exist then. The White House successfully subverted that process. The Inspector General was supposed to, having decided that the complaint was urgent and valid, which he did, he in this case, by talking to people with firsthand knowledge, one of whom I think we've heard today, Blair, the other day while I was in the air,
This is William
having
Taylor.
concluded that it was his legislative obligation was to turn that over to Congress. He did not do that. He sent it to the White House, he sent it to the CIA Council, and they both decided that it didn't have to go against the law. Okay? It would not have gotten out without leaks. Presumably not the whistleblower. I doubt if the person who was trying at that point to go through this without getting arrested, getting a prosecuted, may succeed. I doubt if he or she was the source of that leak. Other people leaked to Congress. This complaint exists. It should have been sent to you, and it wasn't.
Right.
Without those unauthorized disclosures, for each one of which the person who did that is subject to prosecution. In a certain sense. In theory, it's not classified. That information wasn't classified. However, it had the basic criterion for being classified, which is not national security. It's possible embarrassment to the boss. Now, when I say embarrassment, impeachment would be embarrassing to most people. It's hard to say what would embarrass Donald Trump, actually. He regarding himself as a lynch victim at this point. But, and thus, material that has nothing to do with national security by any standard has been put under the highest level of classification. Code word classification reserved for assassinations, communications intelligence, covert operations of various kinds, to keep it out. And it was successfully doing that. Now, to prosecute the people, they would have to say probably that this was related to national defense. That's not too hard. It had to do with holding up $415 million of aid to Ukraine. I mean, that's national defense, right? So there we are. And so those people whose names we haven't heard were crucial to getting this out. If he is impeached as a result of this information, it will be due not only to the whistleblower, but to other people who decided that the public and Congress should know information that was being withheld from them.
I would love to get into, and let's say it's she, the whistleblower, how she, the whistleblower, what she would be thinking about right now, and try to get at motivation and that pivot you make to summon courage to come forward. But even before we get to that, I think equally interesting is thinking about President Nixon and the attempt to conceal to save his presidency. And what motivates Trump seems somehow different. It's very transactional. This was really about, he wanted an investigation of Joe Biden and his son. And he said, if you want that aid, you're going to start the investigation. And if you want a meeting with me personally in the White House, you're going to have to launch that investigation. And I just wonder if you could comment on those two motivations of the two contexts. Is what motivates Trump that different from what motivates Nixon? And what motivates this whistleblower that different from what motivated you?
On Trump and Nixon, no. I don't know how many people even now have it in mind that Richard Nixon did do what Trump was accused of doing in terms of colluding with a foreign power in affecting foreign policy to improve his own chances of election. That's what Trump is accused of doing by Mueller, and Mueller did not find direct evidence of that. May or may not have happened, but he didn't have evidence of that. Nixon did do that, and we don't have the evidence did not become public fully until just a couple of years ago. Actually, all this time later, namely And it was known through wiretaps, pardon me, of, not of Nixon as far as we know, but of the Vietnamese embassy and some of Nixon's people by the FBI, who discovered that Nixon's helpers at that time, subordinates including Richard Allen and others, were telling the Vietnamese ambassador, Bui Diem, whom I knew from Vietnam, that he should not go to Paris for negotiations that had just been announced because he would get a better deal, which was true, from Richard Nixon. Nixon was running for president. This was absolutely critical to the election because Nixon had been running well ahead of Humphrey because Humphrey wouldn't come out against the bombing for fear of what Johnson would do to him until the very end of the campaign in September. At the point when he did begin to criticize the bombing and say that he would end it, Humphrey, his polls began to rise until he was almost even with Nixon in the polls. At the very last minute, the negotiations were announced by LBJ, and Thieu was going to go to Paris and take part in the negotiations. At this point, Humphrey went right up, even with Nixon, and a little above him, was about in. At which point, Thieu announced that he would not go to Paris. Humphrey's polls leveled off, and he was slightly unelected, 500,000 votes in the national thing. Had Thieu not made that announcement, Humphrey would have won.
Right.
And it was his intention, I believe, to end the war. Now, what Johnson knew but didn't tell us, that's another story, was that Nixon had been telling Thieu, don't go to Paris. He was colluding with a foreign power to affect his election, and it was critical to the election. Thieu said to a former friend of his, later that he imprisoned, my friend Tran Yuk Chow, who had been a classmate of his in military, I elected Nixon. And he had.
Right.
And keep in mind what that meant from then on. It was quite mysterious. Some of you here are no doubt Vietnam scholars, but you'll know that it's mysterious why Nixon was so determined that Thieu must stay. That was the sticking point. That's why 23,000 more Americans had to die and another million. Thieu cannot be excluded from the government. Thieu could have impeached Nixon any day of the week by revealing his tapes on his conversations with Nixon beforehand, which were clearly extortion. Right. I think he had blackmail on Nixon at every point there. And, but in any case, that's what Nixon did. So in the first case, we have there doing what what Thieu is accused of doing with Russia.
You can't
but
help
was
but
clearly doing with Ukraine.
I can't help but think of Roy Cohn speaking out across generations from Nixon to Trump in advising on these kind of scenarios of I don't know, there's just such a dark hand in this. But that's the Nixon-Trump comparison. And what about the whistleblower comparison?
How did Nixon get away with it so long in his reputation? One thing was, there really is no paper trail convicting Nixon on this. Johnson had to deal with the fact that on the one hand, he had questionably legal taps that this was based on, the FBI. Right. And second, there was really no proof that Nixon had been involved. And it was 2 years ago that John Farrell in a biography reports on a little known, is he here?
Another Globe reporter who we know and love,
right.
John Ellsberg.
Who came up with the fact, just 2 years ago, that in his biography, that he'd found a little known, hadn't been seen before, part of Haldeman's diary, which had been kept classified,
right.
that P, the boss, the president, ordered me to derail the Paris negotiations and to set this in motion. It's the first time they really connected Nixon with it. Now I come back to saying without Alex Butterfield, it's very hard to connect the president with these things. There are layers of cover, plausible denial that are above all intended to protect the president from proof that he has committed criminal acts or terribly dangerous acts. I might say that when I released the Pentagon Papers, it was in the hope, I didn't have the documentary evidence on Nixon. I knew he was making threats of nuclear war from Lord Halpern and others, but I didn't have the proof of it. Nixon feared I did because various people that I knew did have those documents, and they had left the government, but they hadn't given them to me
Right.
or anyone else. But he feared I did, and that's why he was sending people to blackmail me into silence. But meanwhile, as I say, that proof didn't exist.
Right.
Now, in the case of Trump, as I say, we haven't found the evidence that Trump himself ordered deal with the Russians and so forth. Only in Nixon's case, with Butterfield revealing the tapes, was deemed confirmed.
Right.
So, and those tapes nobody knew about. He was not a president who made his criminal acts on a phone with 12 other officials listening in. Trump actually committed this criminal act putatively.
Right.
He's entitled to a fair trial, of course. In fact, several fair trials, I would say. But it would appear there's grounds for indictment here. And he did this with 12 people listening in.
Right.
And moreover, repeated it in public. Okay, so I'll get to a difference here that I think.
And just briefly, just to put a bow on that, the testimony yesterday is really stunning in how direct and on the record it is, saying that it was an order of the president to not release the aid unless there was the investigation, and the meeting would then happen as well. And that is impeachable, isn't it? Do you see an impeachment more likely?
I'm not a lawyer.
Yeah.
I'm a defender.
Been around a lot, though.
I'm a defender. but what I read is that is definitely impeachable. Lawyers say that. And the people listening
Right.
all felt that.
Right.
Lock that down
Right.
fast, they say. Now, we are not aware that one of them said to the president, and maybe we'll learn, to the president, listening to this, some of them in the room with him, including, I believe, Pompeo. Mr. President, you've just misspoken. That was out of line.
Right.
You'd better correct this. Like, make another phone call. Say, wait, I misspoke here, nothing to do, forget it. Investigate, don't investigate, has nothing to do. Yes, you've got your money, no problem. They could have done various things. We're not aware that any one of them suggested decriminalizing what he had just done, purging himself of that, let alone exposing it. No, the response was, what was to be expected really from an insider is lock it up, definitely. Although a couple of them may have spoken to the whistleblower and let, like Fulbright, like let him or her, let her put it out.
Right. Let them handle it.
Yeah. So but here's a difference, I think, that is very different. And Nixon, Mulvaney, isn't that his name, the chief of staff, said the other day, look, this happens all the time.
He said it was there was a quid pro quo, but then he walked it back the next day.
Yeah, he says it's a quid pro quo. Now, he was missing the point that this was blatantly to do with an election. That's not every day of the week that you have that. But as I say, it's not unique either. So I say Nixon was doing it secretly, absolutely.
Right.
And he wasn't the only one, absolutely not. So let's say it was for an election. How uncommon? Is this the first time that's happened? Absolutely not. I'm sure not. It was the first. But those presidents did it covertly, very carefully, with plausible denial. Now, is he simply careless? No doubt. Is he simply stupid? Well, in some ways, yeah, but not in others. He's president. He got to be president. Does he not have a sense of what the Constitution calls for? What is a criminal? Probably so. I'll bet he could say no criminal intent, and so forth. I didn't think I was breaking the law. The difference, though, is he has a long record here that he's not only ignorant of the Constitution, he rejects it. He rejects any notion that there is any restraint on him due to law, international treaties, Constitution. He's very clear. I, the president, can do, he said it to a political audience, I can do anything I want. Now, he's not the first to think that. Nixon said to David Frost, having to do with the break into my psychoanalyst office. That's what frosted action. President said, when the president does it, it's not illegal. Now, he thought that all along, but notice when he said it, after he was out, and as a private citizen, he did not say that publicly. The other presidents didn't say it publicly, and I don't think Nixon really opposed our Constitution. He broke it.
Yeah.
It's like saying, people break traffic laws, but it's not as though they're against traffic laws. We have a president now who took the oath that I did. His words are a little different: protect and defend. To defend and support the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I believe he's a domestic enemy of the Constitution right now. And again, just to put this in a context, and I'm not just pulling this off the wall, I've believed this at least once before. I thought that Vice President Richard Cheney was very consciously and consistently a domestic enemy of the Constitution in the sense of that oath. He thought there should be a different one. He was patriotic, he was conscientious, he wanted the best for this country, and the best for this country required a president unconstrained by the Constitution, wanted a king, I that was not constrained by impeachment or anything else.
I would say
I think that Donald Trump is that way now. He's not the vice president, he is the president. And that requires not waiting 2 years to get him out of office. It requires getting him out.
And Congress should move to impeach and
Absolutely.
will.
And the Senate,
And you think they will?
And the Senate, unless they are to be absolutely complicit, which they've shown every willingness to do up till now, and that's not a rhetorical statement. Yeah. The president says, I could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and my base would be with me. Which member of the Senate and Republicans is not part of that base? Which member of the Congress, Senate, or House has indicated that they would not, there are limits beyond which they would not go? We haven't seen it yet, although a couple, Romney and a couple of others, have expressed some question.
We never will know what motivates Donald Trump, of course. But I do think from one observation might be that it seems like he's so transactional a president that the higher power is not the Constitution. It may be the sort of business capitalism leanings of, if you want what he would conceive in his own mind as my money, then you're going to do what I want. And I think that may be what we see, what really maybe drove him. But we don't know, and we'll find out. I wanted to say there's two other big chunks I want to get to, and I want to invite questions. I noticed the clock is not working. So what time are we at right now? So yeah, we're going to have to move quick. So basically, I wanted to say, I don't think we're going to have time to really dig deep into the legal documents that will be in the archive. Yeah. But if there's anything there you want to get to. But I did want to get to one piece of this, which is your work that's really chronicled in the Doomsday Machine. It's extraordinary work around a culpability you felt in being one of those who was an architect of the nuclear policy in the United States over the last, a policy that's continued over 70 years. And that from your writing in this book, you describe as being as insane today as it was even 70 years ago when it was just getting rolling. This is extraordinary work. I know I'm not alone in having insufficient knowledge of your work in this area. I think the archive will be just so wonderful to go through with this. But many of the documents you did photocopy that had to do with the nuclear program, we will never see. Is that correct? Or a lot of them have been released now, but wasn't there a huge stash that your brother had hid?
Oh, yeah, right, a lot were lost, unfortunately.
Yeah. But I just want to say, what do we need to know about this moment in time with a presidency that, again, wants to undercut and undermine so many decades of work that have been done on nuclear disarmament? With just a few minutes, really, a short answer, and I do want to go to a couple questions if we can. I know we're going to go over, but could you just give us a sense of this moment in the Doomsday Machine? In the end of your book, you do a beautiful job spelling out very concrete ways that we can find solutions to this. Help us get our head around what needs to be done in this moment for more nuclear deterrence and sanity?
At this moment.
Yeah. It's so not on the radar. I feel like
Yeah.
I couldn't put this book down because what you're writing is riveting and it's so urgent and we're not thinking about it. What would you say is something that we need to think about?
See,
right now?
I can talk about things that could be legislators or executive directives. It is so far from being a matter of the public debate and the consciousness that it's hard for me to imagine these things being brought up even in Congress to speak of, let alone passed on. In other words, a process of public education has to be done very quickly, somehow, from almost scratch, from almost nowhere. 40 years ago, in the early 80s, thanks to Physicians for Social Responsibility and the Freeze movement, really there was a lot of public education on, I remember there was a PSR, Physicians for had a program where they showed every city what would happen if a 1 megaton bomb exploded in that city in some detail, and people actually knew the question, answer to questions. For example, here's a very select audience. Let me ask a question, answer it honestly. How many people here could say they know the difference between an A bomb and an H bomb? I see 7, 8 hands. How many do not, actually? Well, that's normal now, and it was normal before the PSR program and after it. And I'll just say that's sort of the first class, the second class of a high school, middle school class on nuclear era and something. People know nothing, essentially. And so they don't, I'll give you one sentence bottom line on that for those who did not know. Nearly all of our weapons now are H-bombs, thermonuclear bombs, fusion bombs, which were not exploded until experimental model in 52, a first droppable bomb in 54, 9 years after Hiroshima. Every H-bomb, of which we have thousands, requires a Nagasaki-type A-bomb, atomic bomb, fission bomb, as its trigger, its detonator. It takes a Nagasaki bomb to explode an H-bomb. And nearly all of the weapons in the world now, actually,